This is Gene Rossov at Iodine Products Incorporated in Miami, Florida. We're going to be talking today about iodine's role in evolution, cognition, the life cycle of health and disease, and how these things relate to society and education. There's a great deal to be learned. We've got a couple of hours of very interesting work to do ahead of us. Iodine's role in biology is going to be our first piece of study from the very beginning of evolutionary history, the beginning of man on Earth. We're going to talk about how iodine itself created an evolutionary opportunity and how it impacts cognition, health, and disease. And we'll see that there isn't an area or a minute of life that is untouched by iodine. And we'll also address the educational and social dimensions, how without enough iodine, society falls apart and education itself fails. In 1908, Nobel laureate Professor Elie Metchnikow said that most diseases begin in the digestive tract. This happens when bad disease microbes outnumber good microbes and dysbiosis occurs. This leads to a progressive chronic inflammatory condition in which cancer, organ degradation, debilitating early aging, and early vision loss can occur. Iodine encourages helpful microbes and kills destructive ones, promotes cell turnover and metabolic health. It's an evolutionary truth. Our world is low in dietary and in respiratory iodine. But sadly and weirdly, iodine is inexpensive. It's easy to get. It can be infused into food. It can be applied topically. It can be taken through eating and drinking. It can be breathed. It can be injected. My general perspective is that the future of global health is in your hands, in the hands of those who counsel the world on dietary issues. And this can be part of the nutritional guidance you deliver to your patients. As one core perspective, we should understand that iodine modulates metabolism and beneficial behavior. Studies on jail populations show that iodine intake significantly can reduce aggression in jail populations, and very much the same in adolescent classrooms. Iodine improves calmness and attention of students. In pregnancy, iodine eases the potential for issues of pregnancy, preventing preterm births, miscarriages, and preeclampsia. Pregnancy without iodine supplementation can lead to a subsequent lifetime of hypothyroidism for both mother and child. And iodine in mid and later life reduces memory loss and the potential for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and the loss of vision. A 2025 article from one of Indonesia's medical schools says that, quote, with good nutrition, society avoids disease, disability, and death, and this quality of life benefit creates national productivity. This is very smart writing. It's quite simple and quite direct. Avoiding disease, disability, and death, creating national quality of life, and engendering national productivity. Here in the United States, however, we are not doing this. 30% of all US women, childbearing age 15 to 45, are iodine deficient for the CDC. 30% of their babies are born IQ depressed, typically by 10 to 15 IQ points. What does that mean? Well, a 15-point IQ increase in the child population would add 20 to 25 trillion dollars in combined public sector and economic benefits over a working generation, maybe two of them, 40 years, and it could be even more. Nationwide cognitive optimization, that is, iodine repletion via diet, food toxin removal, early nutritional education, provides the highest ROI of any public health investment imaginable or possible. And it would eliminate the federal deficit in 20 to 30 years. So let's see if we can start today. Iodine is in the ocean, almost all of it, and we'll see why later in a moment. Seaweeds concentrate iodine 100,000 times out of seawater. All of them do that. The most effective is laminaria, which is a brown algae, and they're found mostly in cold or cold temperate waters. And they contain 3,000 to 8,000 times the amount of iodine in seawater on a gram by gram basis. They're present around many islands, maybe most islands, and ocean winds blowing across these iodine rich beds of seaweed provide iodine rich air to the island's inhabitants. Our first life in early evolutionary history evolved in iodine rich marine environments near the surface of the ocean. And iodine's peculiar and unique chemistry, which we'll study in a moment, is central to evolution. No other halogen and no other element behaves with as much complex capability as iodine does. And our evolutionary history has made use of iodine's remarkable capabilities. Only clouds which arise over the ocean can carry iodine to the land. There's very little iodine in the soil generally. Ocean arising clouds create iodine-rich plants, and they feed insects, animals, birds, and generate healthy beings. The biochemistry of iodine. It's absorbed via the sodium iodide symporter, NIS, N for natrium, natrium iodide symporter. The history of the sodium iodide symporter is that it was discovered. Um, we went looking for something like that in 1960, and it's become a central tenet, central element of many different kinds of research, including cancer research. We can talk about that later. The sodium iodide symporter is a 634 amino acid filter that pulls iodine into cells against the sodium gradient. Iodine is oxidized by thyroid peroxidase incorporated into tyrosyl residues to form T4, the inactive hormone, and T3, a little bit of it is converted at the thyroid, but most of it is converted on site by individual cells throughout the body and pulled into those cells via the sodium iodide symporter. It uses the sodium potassium adenosine triphosphatase chemistry, and the NIS sodium iodide symporter creates a secondary gradient which concentrates iodine inside the thyroid, pulls iodide from the bloodstream into the thyroid. I should add, as a point of information, when you eat or drink iodine, it's converted almost instantly to the anion iodide form in the stomach. And the reason is that it's this form that we really need, and which the sodium iodide symporter pulls into the cells and into the thyroid. It takes energy to pull this stuff into cells and into the thyroid. And it's contrary to the usual equilibrium because of the sodium content of the cell. So energy from the sodium potassium ATPase process drives the sodium iodide symporter. Iodine's electrical chemistry is really unusual. Iodine is the heaviest element in the body, unless you have a titanium leg or something like that. Its chemical behavior is unlike any other element. It's highly polarizable. Its electrons are loosely held, and the molecules of iodine, two iodine atoms, interact easily with electromagnetic fields and are readily dissolved in lipids. It has a low bond dissociation energy, which facilitates reduction oxidation activity and also antimicrobial activity. It is soluble in lipids. Molecular iodine dissolves readily in nonpolar solvents, the fats of cells and cell membranes. Um, it also readily reverses. Uh, Molecular iodine can shuttle back and forth between the anion, between hypoiodous acid, a very powerful antimicrobial, and between iodate, IO3. And therefore, iodine supports a broad list of biochemical roles. It's both an electron acceptor and electron donor, and it is unique in biological halogen chemistry. The thyroid is evolution's iodine reservoir, the human body's iodine reservoir, and this is true for all mammals, but it isn't true only for mammals. 500 million years ago, marine invertebrates accumulated iodine residues for its antioxidant, antimicrobial, and metabolic role. And these invertebrates developed in surface area seaweed beds in the presence of bound and free iodine along with sunlight and created a series of complex chemistries relying on iodine. Cephalochordates, like animals like the Amphioxus, possess something like a thyroid. We call it an endostyle, and it concentrates iodine in the pharynx of this of Amphioxus. Jawless vertebrates like lampreys start with an endostyle when they're born, but it transforms itself into a true thyroid after metamorphosis. Jawed vertebrates, beginning with sharks, developed a true thyroid. And that was about 400 million years ago, just about the time that we started trying to leave the ocean. I think that was probably a mistake, but I didn't run the world at that time. And so, therefore, those of us who left the ocean had to have working thyroids in order to preserve iodine and in its forms of T4, mostly thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine, and T3, triiodothyronine. And these hormones, possessed by most of the animals that live on the planet, and in some cases, certain plants, most plants actually use iodine in various ways. Insects, birds, all mammals. Uh, Iodine is critical in the thermoregulation for these creatures and for us, their basal metabolism and their neurophysiological development and growth and their health. And this has been true for the last half billion years or so. Relative to the cellular role of iodine-based hormones, T4 and then T3, T4 is changed to T3 at the cellular interface. T3 is the active form, T4 the circulating inactive form. It's very practical. You circulate the stuff and you change it to the active form at the cell. T4 has a half-life of about 7 days. T3, half-life of less than a day. And T4 and T3 in the plasma fraction of the blood circulating around um, is bound to uh, thyroxine binding globulin, TBG. Thyroid synthesis is 90% T4 and about 10% T3. So what happens at the cellular interface is that the T4 is converted to T3 via a chemical called glutathione peroxidase. There are actually several species of it, but in general, glutathione peroxidase 1 converts T4 to T3 and acts as what we call a deiodinase. It removes one of the electrons, creates T3, the active form, out of T4. And glutathione peroxidase is the backbone of activity in the creation of active thyroid hormone, and it itself relies upon selenium. You can't have glutathione peroxidase without selenium. And selenomethionine is the active biochemical precursor, and all people without exception, humans without exception, in my opinion, we'll see later why I would say this, should take 200 micrograms of selenomethionine. You can get selenium in a couple of 3 different forms, but the selenomethionine is the most biochemically useful. Selenomethionine is involved in all mitochondrial functions due to its activity with iodine, and T3 is involved in every mitochondrial function. It enters the nucleus, it binds to thyroid hormone receptors, and then it regulates the transcription, creation of mitochondrial and metabolic genes. And There are various genes that are upregulated in the course of using T3. These are, to be a little bit technical, cytochrome C oxidase, COX subunits, NADH, which is a dehydrogenase nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, ATP synthase components, which you're familiar with as adenosine triphosphate, uncoupling proteins, which take proteins apart and make them more useful in their smaller units, and PGC1 alpha, which is a master regulator of the development of the mitochondria. There is a critical importance for iodine-based hormones in the maintenance of health. And the result of having it available is that we enhance the activity of the mitochondria. We enable respiratory enzyme content and oxidative phosphorylation, which really is key to feeling well and behaving and acting in good health and being able to breathe and use oxygen. Iodine and its hormones regulate cell death and cell birth, and cells which don't die, which do not experience apoptosis, can more readily become cancer cells or burden the body with useless activity. Undying cells can fail to be replaced in an absence of thyroid hormone, and aging cells which don't die not only are burdensome, but they also cause severe rapid aging. We need cell turnover. Iodine effectuates cell turnover. There is no cell in the body which does not die or get born without a molecule of iodine. Iodine thereby and therefore influences protein synthesis and directly influences cellular growth. And for example, in the brain, iodine builds intellectual capability and memory and logic and maturity. How? In a few cases, through the building of new cells, although only the hippocampus and a couple of other areas of the brain actually create new cells after a certain moment following birth. But every cell in the brain, in every area we look at, grows little hair-like features, which we call dendrites. And those dendrites interact with one another, electrically interact with one another, and create links between cells. And those linkages between cells are the very physiological foundation of intellectual capability. Not necessarily more cells, but the linkage between cells. It's an interesting metaphor for how humans need to work together. The cells in our brain work better and better as they grow these sort of very tenuous, extremely small, fragile tentacles or roots, dendrites. And those dendrites actually represent learning. There's been a tremendous amount of fascinating study that shows that when you study something, there's a initial element of memory that grasps that. Say the definition of a new word. You learn the word superfluous, and you learn that it means not especially necessary. But only after the brain has created dendrite interaction does that concept of the understanding and the definition of the word superfluous actually become encoded in your intellectual capability. That capability cannot be achieved without iodine. In the brain, iodine makes you smarter. It promotes neurogenesis, nerve growth, and arborization, which I just described. It creates new cells in the hippocampus and the subventricular zone, some in the prefrontal cortex, but mostly in the hippocampus in the subventricular area. And it develops the neuronal precursors to cell proliferation. It supports this growth of these little fine root hairs, dendritic arborization, and with them, the formation of electrical relationships between the cells of the brain, synapse formation. Synapses are spaces between the cells through which electrical activity occurs. They don't touch, they reach out to one another. It's a very beautiful metaphor for what we on Earth should be doing to one another, should be reaching out to one another as the cells in our brain reach out to one another. Iodine regulates some cell development, astrocyte maturation, and also the covering of cells, the oligodendrocyte differentiation, which is the myelin coating on cells, which in certain areas of aging, like Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's, myelination does not function properly, and the electrical activity between the cells of the brain doesn't work. T3 is our key biochemical conductor, in addition to its mitochondrial roles. It orchestrates the behavior of turnover in all of our tissues. It balances cell death and cell renewal. Again, my simple mnemonic device is no cell in the body dies and is reborn without a few molecules of iodine. As a matter of perspective, iodine is most active in the intestinal epithelium, where you have an extremely high turnover rate of cells, 2 to 3 days. In the skin, about once a month, all of your cells slough off and are replaced by healthy cells, and the blood replaces itself every 120 days, a little more rapidly if we encourage it. Giving blood is encouraging to hematopoietic cell development. T3 also has other mechanisms in which it creates genomic nuclear receptor mediated activity and growth, and also a series of non-genomic mechanisms. The genomic ones referring to the functions of RNA and DNA, and non-genomic mechanisms mean underlying biochemistry. You can get too little iodine, which is generally the case, or sometimes too much. I've been the recipient of too much, although I've never had thyrotoxicosis. But excess iodine, really a lot of excess iodine, can be a significant issue. It can disrupt cell turnover and can have an effect on the gut, the brain, the skin, and the liver, which is the place in the body that filters out and gets rid of stuff that isn't particularly useful. In the area of fetal development, iodine is absolutely, unequivocally, 100% critical, especially in the first few days of life. It's also important in pre-pregnancy for both men and women. If you don't have sufficient iodine, your sperm cells will be lazy and they may actually be defective. If you don't have enough iodine, your deficiency of iodine can cause permanent iodine defective uh, development, and we call that cretinism. It's irreversible. It can lower intelligence of the fetus, which can be permanent. A modest iodine deficiency tends to slow down brain development, which can be semi-permanent, can be overcome postpartum with sufficient iodine, and difficult to perceive subclinical deficiency tends to derail emotional and behavioral development. That can be life-changing for youngsters, their parents, their families, their mom and dad. So iodine is critical in the maternal, parental, paternal, placental, fetal axis. Early iodine deficiency results in a minimum IQ insufficiency of 10 to 15 IQ points, and it's permanent. It determines core personality and the behavioral frameworks within which occur learning capability, attention span, cognitive acuity, mood, and the ability to interact socially and uh, perform social learning and adhere to social norms. And it is definitively linked to poor school performance and aggression, and it is potentially correctable with prenatal and early postpartum supplementation. So, what happens to the mother? Well, the developing fetus takes an enormous burden from the mother. It puts an enormous burden on the mother by absorbing, requiring, demanding uh, the thyroid hormone produced by the mother. And this generates typically twice or so the usual or normal enteric iodine needed by the mom. And the mother donates her thyroid hormones to the baby. It's in the nature of life and development. And therefore, hypothyroidism is common in maternity, and it can be transient or it can be permanent. And if it becomes permanent, which it can be if there's insufficient iodine intake by the mom, this damages the thyroid permanently, permanently, and consigns the mother to a life of constant problems, being cold, being tired, sleeping poorly, being emotionally confused from time to time, having general ill health, and underlying it all, having poor cell turnover rate. Well, the reason that the professional societies don't warn mothers about this problem um, is not that they haven't tried to warn the doctors. They can't reach the mother, so they must reach the physicians. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have in their professional publications many, many times counseled their colleagues to supplement mothers with iodine. And the normal supplementation available uh, typically doesn't have nearly enough iodine. Some of them do. Some of them are adequate, but most of them are not. But then there's another problem, and it's a problem that has become more obvious over the last 3 or 4 years. It turns out that the thyroid thinks or appears to think that fluoride is iodine, but it can't use fluoride to form thyroid hormones, and fluoride in any moderate quantity displaces iodine at the thyroid interface. And just to put that in context, um, we've reduced the amount of available, allowable fluoride in drinking water to zero point 0.7 milligrams per liter. zero point 0.7 milligrams, that's 700 micrograms. That amount of fluoride will then interact with what should be the daily intake of a mom, which might be 250 micrograms. There's 3 times as much fluoride being presented to the thyroid as there is iodine. And even adequate iodine intake is suppressed by fluoride. So in our great desire to solve one problem, uh, pediatric dental cavities, we've created another problem that's much, much bigger, much more expensive, much more dangerous, and very poorly researched. And it's been in place for 50 years, 75 years. So in the presence of fluoride, if you do a test for urinary iodine concentration on the mother, it seems like the urinary iodine is normal. but that iodine is not being used. So this is a false reading. The iodine isn't being used to create thyroid hormones, and we've been doing this to our populations for 75 years. It's made Americans stupider, less healthy, less active, less intelligent. And no matter how much money we spend training teachers to be effective with youngsters, all the excellent educational materials on the planet cannot combat the fact that a child doesn't have the capacity to sit still, to think, to behave. And we've also destroyed a significant portion of the mother's health and consanguinity. So this commitment of ours to dental health may have produced shining smiles, but it has produced very overcast learning, deadly emotional development, and a tremendous drain on the potential for life income for the child. This is an overstatement. I'm not I'm not exaggerating. It's clinically proven baseline scientific truth. There are other iodine-like halogens that present themselves and represent a threat to the intake of iodine. One of them is perchlorates, and of course is chlorine in drinking water. These are all very lightweight products that tend to displace iodine at the thyroid interface. And we're going to come back to the question of, well, given these problems, how much iodine should we be taking? I have some recommendations about that. Talk about it in the context of my own self-experiments. But the combination of excess fluoride, of perchlorates, of chlorine, and the reduction in iodine intake is and has been an American tragedy. And the result of it is that America, which once was, when I was a kid, I was born in 1947. America in 1947 was #1 in world IQ. And we know this because we've tracked IQ uh, from the people who enter the armed forces. So every person goes into the armed forces, takes an IQ test. And we know how the IQ of Americans overall has been declining over the last 75 years. It's just a tragedy. Um, so that is the problem here. Relative to iodine and aging, iodine supports longevity, supports mitochondrial function, supports basal metabolism, and its comprehensive diversity and activity support a long and healthy life. Uh, Japanese island dwellers, like the folks who live on the island of Okinawa, have 3 to 5 times the percent of uh, Japanese citizens compared to the number of Westerners who live to say 100 or 90 or 80 in good health, in disease-free health. And part of that is that the fallout from that is that Japanese pay anywhere from a half to a fifth of what we pay for healthcare because we accrue these problems towards the end of life, and then it becomes very expensive to keep us alive. Iodine deficiency accelerates degeneration and degenerative diseases like loss of vision, like glaucoma, like cataracts, like age, so-called age-related macular degeneration. And these vast environmental changes have created enormous deficiencies in iodine and enormous disease deficiencies throughout Western populations. Iodine is protective against oxidative stress. It is essential for cell apoptosis and reproduction. It's critical, central for organ function. It fights infectious diseases. It fights chronic conditions and maintains general immunity and overall neurophysiology. Low iodine is associated with fibrocystic breast disease and eventually cancer. Poor iodine intake reduces immune activity generally. It reduces cell turnover, and cells which should die but don't turn over increase the risk of cancer and cause general dyspepsia in the individual. Iodine deficiency is directly linked to prostate, thyroid, and breast cancer. Iodine supports immune surveillance and repair in its numerous multiple forms. Iodine and thyroid hormones repair cell damage, increase cell turnover and replacement, increase cell health and performance, and it is a key feature of energetic health maintenance and healthy aging. What causes iodine deficiency in adults? Well, non-coastal living, rainwater that does not arise over the ocean produces soil that's iodine depleted. Coastal living has been a key feature of evolutionary brain development and the development of intelligence. Um, think back to our our forefathers, the founders of our country, living 250 years ago. They ate every single day. They ate cod, beans, corn, all on the coast of New England. They imbibed tremendous quantities of iodine, way, way, way more than the so-called recommended daily allowance of today. And the result was they were smart as heck. If you read what they wrote, how they thought, how they interacted, how they came together as a very large group and created the foundation for what is arguably the greatest country in the world at the moment. It happened because they were very smart. In the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered North America and northern Eurasia about 20, 25,000 years ago, um, wasn't possible or wasn't easy to live in that time period. But over time, by 12,000 years ago, the glaciers had receded into the ocean, and they pulled off the topsoil and depleted moraines and sediments and post-glacial soil inland and high latitude regions. And these are strikingly low in bioavailable iodine. Coastal counties, states, and countries which have a long coastline have higher iodine intake populations. Used to be that you could salt your food and at least get a reasonable moiety of iodine. No longer. Our company, by the way, makes an iodized potassium salt, and we do that because the U.S. population is generally iodine deficient and generally potassium deficient. How come? Well, we don't eat our green vegetables, our leafy green vegetables. Most of agriculture, large-scale agriculture, uses well water and river water. Can't rely on rain when you're growing 100 acres of crops. You have to rely on well water and river water, and therefore there's no iodine in that water, and therefore no iodine in the plants that are growing. Plants don't particularly care. There are many plants that grow better uh, in mildly iodized water, and there's been a lot of very good research, interesting research on that. But at the moment, plants and the animals that eat those plants are iodine insufficient. And we don't recognize it in animals. They don't suffer from the worst elements of iodine deficiency. Well, sometimes they do, but it's rare. Because in agriculture, the farmers make sure that um, maternal mammals like cows, sheep, and goats receive appropriate iodine so their children are not born deformed and non-viable. But the tissue does not retain iodine. So you're not going to get very much iodine from uh, most of the various meats. Uh, and what do we get our iodine from, if not salt? Well, really oddly, and this is one of the really odd, truly oddest things about the US problem with iodine. It's milk, cow milk, bovine milk. And why is that? It's not because the cows are taking it in and giving it to us instead of to their calves. It's because farmers clean milking equipment with iodophores. And the residue of iodophores on that milking equipment is what provides the majority, and I mean the majority of iodine that Americans get. If you're not drinking milk, cow milk, you're not getting iodine. And it's completely adventitious. It's utterly by chance. If a farmer didn't thoroughly wash out the iodophores, there's going to be more iodine in the milk for that batch. And if he did, there might be none. And we've tested this all over the country. The HHS and FDA and CDC have tested it, and there's just no rationality to the amount of iodine in milk. We know there's some. There's more than there is in salt because the salt has been sitting around and subliming iodine. By the time you buy it off the supermarket shelves, there isn't any iodine in salt, even if you wanted to buy a box that says iodized salt. And we have the problem of competing halogens, fluorine, chlorine, and bromine in the diet and environment, in water and air, and these prohibit thyroid uptake of iodine. This is an unrecognized and unseen catastrophe. The thyroid perceives these other halogens as if they were iodine. They have identical atomic shells, and thyroid hormones can't use them. So you can have even adequate iodine uptake, but the competing halogens displace iodine at the thyroid interface, and the urinary iodine concentration tests, the so-called gold standard and laboratory iodine intake measurement, can be adequate or over adequate, but nonetheless, if there are competing halogens in the drinking water and in the air, the UIC may be normal, but the actual available iodine will be totally inadequate. And I can promise you it is one endocrinologist out of 1,000 and one physician out of 10,000 who understands this. They don't get it. And they've never had anyone sit in front of them like me and tell them this stuff. And it's obvious, it's in the literature. I think doctors have time to read their journals or other related journals. There isn't a primary care doc who reads an endocrinology journal, and there isn't an endocrinology doc who who reads an agricultural journal. These guys all operate in silos. And so the result is the medical teams in America do not understand that we are living in a world of iodine deficiency. And it creates enormous problems. And we address those problems, but we don't recognize that it's caused by lack of iodine. So we have all these fancy drugs that are designed to treat people symptomatically when the underlying cause frequently, not all the time, of course, but frequently, is an iodine insufficiency or deficiency. Now, people don't feel well. So patients are treated improperly for symptoms without understanding the root causes of their problem. Iodine in the body and in immunity is extraordinarily interesting. And saliva, everybody's saliva, contains a peroxidase called lactoperoxidase. And there is throughout the body uh, some amount of hydrogen peroxide. And if there's enough endogenous iodine, what happens is that you see this little formula here that hydrogen peroxide plus the anion iodide creates hypoiodous acid and water. Hypoiodous acid is enzymatically produced throughout the upper respiratory tract, in the mouth and the nose, and in the eye, when there's enough iodine, well, as iodide, and enough endogenous hydrogen peroxide, but there must be lactoperoxidase. Hypoiodous acid, or HOI, is highly reactive, highly antimicrobial and is not cytotoxic to mammalian cells. And it produces an innate mucosal defense, but only if we have enough iodine. We take an iodine respiratorily. If you're living in Okinawa, you will take an iodine vapor from the ocean air passing across seaweed beds, and it'll get absorbed into the nasopharyngeal apparatus and into the lungs. If it gets absorbed through the nose and the mouth, it will hang around there and produce hypoiodous acid and help fight disease, airborne diseases, tons and tons of millions of airborne critters that want to make you sick by living off your mouth and your nose and your eyes. Um, but if you're breathing iodine, you are getting anti-cancer molecular iodine into your blood, and this only happens in a natural coastal presence. So this nascent molecular iodine, the iodine molecule, the diatomic halogen molecule, volatile at room temperature, um, is highly lipophilic and oxidizing. It penetrates microbial envelopes, microbial biofilms, and is part of evolutionary antimicrobial defense, developed when we were evolutionarily evolving on the coast, no longer. So just as a sort of summary of iodine in air and our respiratory uptake, what does iodine act against? Well, it has extremely high activity against SARS-CoV-2. If you want to get rid of SARS-CoV-2, for God's sake, I mean, you can if you wish, take the vaccine. Um, I feel that that's more or less playing Russian roulette. Um, although, let's not get into it. It's an interesting subject. But for sure, iodine, inhaled iodine, will have an extremely powerful effect against SARS-CoV-2, influenza, both A and B, respiratory syncytial viruses, including the common cold. And it has an equally powerful effect against adenoviruses and norovirus, which is very persistent in the environment. Uh, has been the demise of many a cruise line cruise. And it's quite effective against Staph aureus, strep pneumoniae, and MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Iodine is, and it is cheap, and it is effective. And you can take it. You don't have to go move to Okinawa if you want more information on it. Our company makes an inhaler that uses respiratory iodine. Iodine is not quite as effective against Pseudomonas and E. coli, but it is very effective against the common diseases, the fungal diseases caused by Aspergillus and Candida. Think candidiasis, very, very common in both male and female populations. And it is somewhat effective against these tiny little mycobacteria, but it requires longer exposure time. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, iodine kills SARS-CoV-2 in a matter of fractions of a second. Fractions of a second. We produce a product um, over which I've had many battles with the Food and Drug Administration, and I've won them. I haven't gone to jail, and we've sold, I don't know, 20, 30,000 of our spray bottles, oral, nasal, anti-CoV-2 product, and it works extraordinarily well, and it's cheap as heck. That's really just a sideline. Tuberculosis is really an interesting one. We realized in the 19th and early 20th centuries that in areas of endemic goiter, such as the valleys of the Alps, and the mountains of the Alps, and Tibet, and in the Himalayas and inland regions of Europe and China, there was an overlap between endemic goiter and high tuberculosis. And before we had antibiotics, um, doctors in Europe and North America used iodine therapeutically for tuberculosis. They knew about it. They used it. They Nobody told them to do it. They figured it out. The Chinese had figured it out literally 2,000 years earlier. And early uh, 20th century reports and uh, current clinical analyses notes that goitrous individuals have a higher prevalence of tuberculosis. There is a thyroid pituitary axis that involves the hypothalamus and a complex feedback mechanism depending upon the various secretions of T4 and T3, uh, thyroid stimulating hormone and thyroglobulin. And this very tightly regulated neuroendocrine system maintains thyroid hormone homeostasis. And it governs the production, regulation of thyroid hormones. And these hormones, of course, control basal metabolism, growth, and development. And heat production keeps us warm, and tissue turnover, the replacement of tissue. And of course, controls brain activity. So the failure of the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis is a genuine medical disaster. And there are a variety of elements that participate in this um, thyroid hypothalamus pituitary axis. And they include thyroglobulin and the sodium iodide symporter that acts with the thyroid to uh, extract more iodine from the plasma fraction of the blood, thyroid peroxidase that catalyzes the iodination via the coupling of tyrosine residues, and deiodinases that control the peripheral use of T4 converted to T3. So as a summary, if you have too little T3 and T4, you're going to have your thyroid, your pituitary producing more thyroid stimulating hormone, telling the thyroid to wake up and do more. And there are a couple of other classes of hypothyroidism, secondary and tertiary, and they have different measures of T3, T4, TSH, and hypothalamic failure. And then there's a condition you might be familiar with, an autoimmune disease called Graves' disease, where you have elevated uh, T3 and T4 and lower thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid winds up self-destructing. It's very problematic, and it isn't hard to cure. It's not hard to cure because you can cure it with uh, carefully mediated iodine therapy. Breast tissue concentrates iodine during pregnancy and lactation, concentrates it as iodide via the sodium iodide symporter. And this is an evolved process that developed so that moms could feed their infants sufficient iodine and all of the wonderful nutrients that are in breast milk. And it ensures iodine delivery to the fetus and the neonate. Now, if the mother isn't taking enough, she's going to be deprived, but not the infant. This occurs in all mammals without exception. And so the iodide content of breast tissue via the sodium iodide symporter, which gets upregulated by estrogen, prolactin, and oxytocin, um, is enormously enhanced and proliferates. And this wonderful 643 layer amino acid filter pulls more iodine out of the plasma into the breast tissue. Um, And whereas the sodium iodide symporter is found pretty much everywhere, it is concentrated in salivary glands, in the breast, um, and throughout key organs of the body, and a fair amount in the brain. In early childhood, iodine is urgent and developmentally essential. After mother's milk, it is absolutely critical that it be present. So you can get iodine from breast milk, you can get a little bit from infant formula, you can get a tiny bit from iodized salt if it hasn't been hanging around too long. You can get a fair amount of it from dairy products. Um, and of course, you get it from seaweed, which is what the Okinawans and the Japanese generally do. The Japanese women eat a ton of seaweed during their pregnancies. And you can get some from eggs and fish, depending upon where they were living at the time. What happens in adolescence can be catastrophic. Iodine intake during adolescence affects brain growth and development, uh, not growth of additional cells, but growth of synaptic contacts. So it affects cognition profoundly and physiological growth. All of those remarkable changes that adolescents go through. And it affects their behavior, their ability to sit still and listen in class, and it affects their socialization. Iodine deficient patients almost invariably will be antisocial, either actively and aggressively or via some other more internalized and perhaps more destructive process. And we know this is true. We've evaluated it in historical and clinical studies. So adolescence is the second critical window for iodine insufficiency following the perinatal period. And given all the remarkable somatic changes and hormonal changes and neurocognitive reorganization the body goes through, these adolescents are highly sensitive to iodine intake. If you're worried about adolescents, look at their iodine intake. It's interesting to understand specifically how iodine affects cognitive function and academic performance, and there are a whole bunch of interesting mechanisms that are occurring. Of course, thyroid hormones dependent on iodine regulate what we call synaptic pruning and plasticity in the prefrontal cortex, where so much thinking actually goes on. Synaptic pruning means the development of synapses not touching but proximate electrical conduction activity, and the plasticity of these connections, their ability to worm in and out of each other and create these remarkable connections, which actually represent learning. They're the physical um, element of real learning. We established this. Heck, I remember when I was a sophomore at Harvard, there was a brilliant neurophysiologist at MIT named Carl Pribram who explored the relationship between intelligence, learning, synaptic pruning, and plasticity. We've known about this, well, since I was maybe 20 years old, so for a good 50 years. It also regulates the myelination and the conductivity, the electrical conductivity of axons regulated by thyroid hormones. You can't have good thinking without sufficient iodine in adolescence and, frankly, at any time of life. Myelination and demyelination occur all the time. Demyelination will occur if there isn't sufficient iodine. Is there a relationship between insufficient iodine and neurophysiological diseases? Absolutely. How direct? We don't know yet. We'll find out. Of course, dopamine and serotonin affect and effectuate neurotransmission, and these are completely dependent upon thyroid hormones. So, core executive brain functions like working memory, attention span, impulse control, modification of aggression, its appropriate and inappropriate uses are determined in part by the availability of sufficient iodine generated thyroid hormones. And iodine deficiency or frank insufficiency, even within adolescents who seem to be euthyroid, that is, they don't have a physically determinable problem with their thyroids, these deficiencies can cause mountains of antisocial behavior. And studies of UK jail populations show that iodine and selenium deficiencies, once ameliorated, greatly improve aggressive behavior. What about iodine deficiency in older adults or in folks my age? I'm an older adult, I'm 76. Iodine deficiency in the elderly is clinically significant. It is under-recognized. We almost never test older adults for impaired thyroid function. We certainly know when they are suffering cognitive decline and fatigue and depression and have a diminished quality of life. Do we actually think to look at what they are eating and its iodine content? So part of the reason for this is the public health policy being compassionate towards youngsters tends to focus on iodine deficiency in pregnancy and childhood, but we don't focus on iodine deficiency in the mom. We don't focus on the evidence that shows that older adults are vulnerable to iodine deficiency. And we don't recognize that the physiological and psychological consequences in the elderly are very, very significant. And many of them have a key tag to iodine deficiency or iodine insufficiency. So to uh, sort of provide in tabular format what's going on in older adults who are insufficient in iodine, frank hypothyroidism, which will express itself as fatigue, intolerance of cold, weight gain. Weight gain? Did somebody say weight gain? Bradycardia, constipation. Americans are clinically constipated. They have peculiar heartbeats. They gain weight. They are intolerant to cold. They're tired. Um, there are physical features that help you recognize this. Puffy face, dry skin, hoarse voice. I apologize for mine. It's from having, I made this recording earlier and I managed to mess it up. So this is my second recording. I've been talking for almost 4 hours. So I feel like Hakeem Jeffries on the floor uh, of the U.S. Congress. Iodine insufficiency causes impaired thermoregulation, which expresses itself as an increased sensitivity to cold and causes more death in wintertime. And we know we have more death in wintertime, and we wonder why. And I can guarantee you that a certain percentage of those deaths are directly related to iodine insufficiency in older adults. And of course, delayed reflexes. And these express themselves as frailty or neuropathy. Think of how many older folks have neuropathy. Does their pediatrician or extremities doc ever say, gosh, how much iodine are you eating? Where are you getting it from? Are you supplementing? Are you taking selenium? Guarantee you, never happens. You could do it, but I can absolutely, totally guarantee you it does not happen in primary care. And I've quizzed primary care doctors, and I know lots of them, including my kids and my brother. They don't know diddly squat about iodine insufficiency in older adults. So this is concurrent with subclinical hypothyroidism, which is elevated thyroid stimulating hormone normal T4, associated with a slowed metabolic rate, depression, cognitive failure, cognitive inefficiency. And we call this normal aging. Nonsense. It is not normal aging. It is unfair and inappropriate and untreated, improperly diagnosed aging. So in general, a what's happened to lack of iodine across the lifespan. We have lower IQ, especially in endemic regions like the Midwest. We have reduced lifetime income, significantly reduced iodine income by millions of dollars for individuals who have iodine insufficiency, and increased emotional instability, behavior dysregulation, poor social integration. Well, look around you. Poor social integration, behavioral dysregulation. There sure is enough of it. I mean, how many times do we read about youngsters and older people, middle-aged folks, packing up their AK-15 and going and killing a whole bunch of folks, whether they're children or adults or folks praying in a church or whatever. Happens all the time in the United States. Why? We have cultivated a framework in which people don't get enough iodine. And one of the key results is increased emotional instability. Um, and just to come back to that subject of tax, if we could raise the IQ of the American public by 15 points, in a matter of 1 or 2 generations, we would have no national deficit. We'd have so much money in the American government's coffers that we wouldn't know how to spend it. Of course, we'd probably figure out how to spend it on weapons of mass destruction. So when you do blood work to assess iodine, you want to make sure you test iodine, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, free T4, free T3 thyroglobulin, and thyroid stimulating hormone is a pretty good marker, but it tends to lag behind urinary iodine concentration. Of course, you should do a UIC test. Thyroglobulin, which should always also be tested, which is elevated in deficiency in goiter. It's a marker of chronic iodine status, and we know this from our work in research in public health. How much should we supplement? Well, it's really an interesting subject. It's one to which I could not have provided you with an honest answer um, 10 years ago. But I now know the answer. Um, the recommended daily allowance is 150 micrograms for adults, 220 micrograms. During pregnancy, the World Health Organization says 250 micrograms. I challenge you to measure the difference between 220 and 250 micrograms. It's ridiculously tiny amount. High risk groups, fetuses, moms, vegans, elderly, pregnant, nursing homes, ALF populations. Who have we left out? Well, sort of middle-aged folks, I suppose. 1,100 micrograms is, according to the CDC and the FDA, too much, but it's not. At least I don't think so. So let me tell you my personal experience. Um, when I realized that nobody could answer the question how much iodine is enough and how much is too much, and how much can I usefully use, 5 years ago, I got myself up to 100 milligrams a day, not micrograms, milligrams, 100 milligrams a day, which is 667 times the recommended daily allowance. I used to have endocrinologists that I was familiar with. I'm still familiar with a bunch of them, whom I insure. They used to say, "How come you're not dead?" And my answer is because I take 200 micrograms of selenium. Selenium is highly protective daily. Selenium is selenium methionine is daily, very, very completely protective against danger and uh, destruction of the thyroid. And in all of my testing, um, quarterly, for every quarter for the last 5 years, I've had consistently what are considered normal thyroid values, T3 and T4, and no nodules in my thyroid, which would be a sign of thyroid doing something funny. However, those 100 milligrams produced a life-threatening change in my electrical activity in my heart, and rather having the pacemaker impulse coming from the ventricular area came from the sinoatrial. It's supposed to come from the sinoatrial area. It began coming from the ventricular area. And I immediately, upon recognizing that, I dropped my iodine intake to 20 milligrams a day, still keeping up the 200 micrograms of selenium, and all of my cardiac functions are now normal with proper sinoatrial electrical impulses. So I've discovered how you can actually hurt yourself with too much iodine in a particular and peculiar way. And I can guarantee you there isn't a soul on the planet and not a cardio electrophysiologist who understands this. Um, I'm about to see one sometime in the next couple of months, and I'm going to quiz him about it. But I know he doesn't understand it. It doesn't exist in the literature. It's important to recognize how critical selenium is for support of thyroid enzymes. It actually effectuates the activity of the conversion of T4 to T3 at the cellular level. You can't use the iodine you imbibe without sufficient selenium. So it's a very good idea, just in general. Take 200 micrograms of selenomethionine. It's easy, it's cheap, it's effective. It guarantees that you'll never have a problem. But keep in mind, all the iodine in the world will not help you unless you can convert T4 to T3, and that only happens by virtue of the activity of selenomethionine forming the grid work for the production of what's called glutathione peroxidase. There are very many species of them, but glutathione peroxidase is really critical for the uptake and use of iodine at the cellular level. And of course, zinc and iron are really required also for solid metabolism. As you are very well aware, I'm sure Americans tend to be potassium deficient. We don't eat enough leafy green vegetables, dark green leafy vegetables. And also, for people who eat a lot of soy or cabbage or broccoli, it can interfere with iodine uptake, but you have to eat an awful lot of it for it to make a difference. And if you can, filter out chlorine and fluoride from your drinking water. It isn't easy to do. Um, Activated charcoal filters work great on chlorine and perchlorate, but they don't work very well on fluoride, and you need a special kind of filter to do that. Um, Not hard to get and not expensive, but worth doing. How are we going to restore iodine sufficiency? Public health programs, education in schools, prenatal supplementation access. Every prenatal counseling center in the United States needs to be made aware of it. And you can help with that. In Japan, which has the highest intake of iodine in the world via seaweed, they have a lower national incidence of breast and thyroid disorders. They have cultural dietary practices that support iodine sufficiency. They have anywhere from 50 to 80% lower healthcare costs and greater healthy longevity. Can't beat it. Don't move to Okinawa. You couldn't do it here. So, in summary, iodine is foundational. Foundational. It's a foundational element of our general biology. It's foundational to thinking. It's foundational, excuse me, to long survival. It is an easy to modify risk factor in public health. It is cheap. I started a nonprofit organization, a 508 nonprofit called the Church of Eden.org that gives away iodine to anybody who asks, preferably women of childbearing age. Free, totally free. For $4, our cost, which we absorb, we can provide a pre-pregnant, pregnant, and postpartum woman with enough iodine for $4 to last her for over 2 years. Got to be crazy not to do it. You have to be crazy not to do it. Why would we not do that? So we have to get scientists and policymakers and agricultural specialists and ethicists, church people, community leaders to become aware. And you could do that. There are enormous, enormous, incalculable tax and societal implications. And you have some challenges. How are you going to get patients to listen to you? How are you going to get doctors to listen to you? They're not going to believe you. Send them to me. How are you going to get legislators to listen to you? They also may not believe you. They may or may not care. There are a series of various references. If you want to call me, I can provide you with a lot more. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to address you. Do not hesitate to get in contact with me. I'm Gene Rossov. If you want to jot down my phone number, it's 305 667 9375. I'm a 24/7 guy. You can call me at 3 in the morning, as many obstetricians have when they have problems with a delivery. And you are welcome to uh, uh, to ask me for support, um, research publications that will back up everything I've been telling you today. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so very much.